So Elvis asked her, "Well then, Dodger, what do you want?" And she said, "Money."
The word hung in the air like a slap Elvis never saw coming. One word from the mouth of the woman who helped raise him. Money, not love, not pride, not even happiness. When Elvis asked his grandmother Dodger what she wanted from him, her answer stripped away every illusion he had about family. She did not hesitate. She did not soften it with explanation. Money. That single word would poison every family gathering, every gift, every embrace for the rest of his short life. Because in that moment, Elvis Presley discovered the price tag on his own bloodline. Minnie Presley had survived things that would break most people before they turned 40. Everyone called her Dodger, though nobody alive remembered exactly why. Some said she dodged death so many times that fate gave up trying. Others whispered she could dodge the truth better than anyone in Mississippi. But the woman who would one day demand money from the world's biggest star had once eaten dirt soup to stay alive during the winter of 1921. She was born into the kind of poverty that leaves scars on your DNA. Her hands learned to pick cotton before they learned to hold a pencil. Education was a luxury reserved for families who knew where their next meal was coming from. Dodger knew hunger like most people know their own name. That hollow ache that sits in your stomach and whispers that tomorrow might be worse than today. By the time she was 16, she had already buried 2 siblings. Yellow fever took one. Starvation took the other. Death was as common as sunrise in the shotgun shacks of Mississippi. You learn not to get too attached to anything that could be taken away. Maybe that included people. Maybe that especially included people. Vernon Presley married her daughter Gladys in 1933, right in the teeth of the Great Depression. Dodger watched that wedding with eyes that had seen too much to believe in fairy tales. She knew Vernon was weak the moment she met him. Soft hands, soft spine, soft promises. But Gladys loved him with the kind of desperate love that poor people cling to when they have nothing else. Love was free, after all. Everything else cost money they would never have. When Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8, 1935, his twin brother Jesse Garon was already dead. Gladys held her living son and her grief with equal intensity. Dodger held the knowledge that this boy would carry the weight of 2 lives from his first breath. One child breathing for 2. One child succeeding for 2. One child carrying double the expectations and double the burden. Dodger moved in with them when Elvis was 3. Vernon had gone to prison for forging a check, and Gladys could not handle the shame and poverty alone. 3 generations squeezed into a 2-room board house that leaked when it rained and froze when winter came. Privacy was another luxury they could not afford. Every empty stomach was heard. Every desperate prayer was shared. Every moment of shame was witnessed by family members who had their own shame to carry. The boy grew up watching his grandmother count pennies like they were prayers. She would sit at the kitchen table every Sunday after church, dividing the few coins they had into smaller and smaller piles. Food, rent, medicine they could not afford but needed anyway. Elvis would watch her weathered hands move those coins around like chess pieces in a game where losing meant not eating. Years later, when psychiatrists would try to understand why Elvis could never say no to anyone who asked for money, they would miss this simple truth. He had watched his grandmother's face when there was not enough. That particular shade of desperation, that specific sound of defeat. He would spend his entire life trying to erase that look from every face he loved. But something else was growing in those years of shared poverty. Dodger was keeping score. Every sacrifice got logged in her mental ledger. Every meal she went without so Elvis could eat. Every winter she spent her last dollar on shoes for him to wear to school. Every time she pretended she was not hungry so Gladys would not worry. The accounting was precise. The interest was compounding. Poor families develop their own economy of guilt and obligation. Nothing is free, especially love. Every favor creates a debt. Every sacrifice demands future payment. Dodger was teaching Elvis this system without saying a word. He was learning that love came with terms and conditions written in invisible ink that would only appear when the bill came due. The first time Elvis sang in public at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair when he was 10, Dodger was there. She watched the crowd respond to her grandson, watched their faces change, watched them lean forward like flowers toward the sun. But while Gladys saw her boy's talent, Dodger saw something else entirely. She saw a lottery ticket. She saw a way out. She saw the end of counting pennies and choosing between food and rent. When Elvis was 13, Dodger pulled him aside after church. Her fingers were particularly swollen that day from arthritis that medication might have helped if they could have afforded medication. She looked at him with eyes that had calculated the cost of raising him down to the penny. "You are going to be something special," she told him, but the way she said special sounded less like a blessing and more like a burden. "You are going to take care of this family." Elvis nodded because that is what good boys do when their grandmothers speak. But something cold settled in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the first understanding that his success would not belong to him. It had already been spent by people who needed it before he had even earned it. The guitar Gladys bought him for his 11th birthday had cost $7.95. Dodger knew because she had counted out the coins they saved for 4 months to afford it. She would remind Elvis of this years later when he was signing his first record deal. $7.95, plus interest, plus compound suffering, plus the cost of believing in him when believing meant going hungry. By the time Elvis was 17, the family dynamics had shifted into something that would have been recognizable to anyone who has ever watched poverty turn into possibility. Dodger stopped being grandmother and started being an investor waiting for returns. Every conversation included subtle reminders of what she had done, what she had sacrificed, what she was owed. Graceland was supposed to be the promised land, but kingdoms built on guilt become prisons for everyone inside them. Elvis bought the mansion in 1957 for $102,500, and Dodger moved in before the paint had dried. She walked through those 23 rooms like she was taking inventory of what survival had finally purchased. Her bedroom was bigger than any house she had ever lived in. The bitter irony was not lost on her. She had to become old to live young. Vernon handled the official finances, but Dodger kept her own books. Hidden in her dresser drawer beneath cotton slips that still smelled like Mississippi poverty was a leather journal where she recorded every dollar that flowed through Graceland. Not the money coming in, that was too vast to track. She documented what went out and, more importantly, to whom. Her grandson Billy got $5,000 for a car. Cousin Harold got $3,000 for medical bills. Deltamy got $8,000 for a house down payment. And Dodger got an allowance like she was a child asking for candy money. The resentment grew like kudzu in August. Silent at first, then suddenly everywhere, choking out everything else. She would sit in the kitchen at Graceland, watching the staff prepare meals that cost more than she had spent on food in entire years of raising Elvis. Those same hands that had mixed flour with water to make paste for dinner were now supposed to be grateful for whatever Elvis decided to give her. Priscilla noticed the coldness first. She had married into this family thinking she understood its dynamics, but Dodger was an education in how poverty trauma never really leaves the body. The older woman would stare at Priscilla's jewelry with a calculation that made the young wife uncomfortable. Not admiration, not even jealousy exactly, more like a butcher estimating the weight of meat on the bone. "That ring could have fed a family for 3 years, Dodger said one morning over breakfast, her voice casual as spreading butter on toast. Priscilla shifted uncomfortably. "Elvis wanted me to have it." "Elvis wants everyone to have everything," Dodger replied, her tone sharpening just enough to draw blood. "Except the people who made him who he is." The conversation ended there, but the war had begun. Dodger started telling Priscilla stories about Gladys that were designed to wound. How Gladys never would have worn such expensive things. How Gladys understood the value of money. How Gladys would have wanted Elvis to take care of family first, wife second. Each story was a perfectly aimed arrow, using a dead woman's memory as the bow. Elvis remained oblivious to most of these battles. His world had become so large that the small wars inside his own home were just background noise. But Dodger was patient. She had waited through poverty, through war, through death. She could wait a little longer to get what she believed she was owed. The manipulation started small. She would mention, just in passing, how generous Elvis was to everyone except the woman who had changed his diapers when Gladys was too exhausted. Little comments dropped like seeds that would grow into guilt. "Remember when you were sick with pneumonia and I stayed up for 3 nights? Remember when Vernon was in prison and I kept you fed? Remember when nobody believed in your music except family?" Other relatives became her unwitting weapons. She would tell Aunt Delta that Elvis had given Uncle Johnny twice what he gave her, then tell Johnny the opposite. Soon, family dinners became competitions of who had sacrificed more, who deserved more, who Elvis loved more based on the monetary evidence. The economy of guilt she had created in poverty had evolved into something more sophisticated and more vicious. Staff members at Graceland would later describe the atmosphere as suffocating. Everyone walked on eggshells around Dodger, knowing she had Elvis's ear and his guilt in equal measure. She could get anyone fired with a casual comment about disrespect or ingratitude. The woman who had once been powerless now wielded her grandson's wealth like a weapon she had waited her whole life to hold. Then came the night that changed everything. December 1973. Elvis had invited business associates for dinner, trying to project the image of a stable, successful family man. Dodger had been drinking gin since lunch, something she had started doing more frequently as her body aged and her bitterness fermented. The conversation turned to Elvis's generosity, his charitable donations, his gifts to strangers. Dodger's fork hit her plate with a sound like a judge's gavel. "Generous," she repeated, tasting the word like something rotten. "Let me tell you about generous." Elvis's eyes found hers across the table. Something in them begged her to stop. She did not stop. "This generous man right here forgets where he came from, forgets who went hungry so he could eat, forgets who stayed awake wondering how to pay rent while he was dreaming about stages." Her voice was rising, decades of resentment finally boiling over. "You want to know about sacrifice? I sacrificed my entire life for him. My health, my comfort, my dignity. And what do I get? What does Dodger get?" The table was silent. Except for the sound of ice melting in glasses, nobody dared to lift. "I get to watch him throw money at strangers while I have to ask permission to buy a new dress. I get to see him buy cars for people he met yesterday while I remember saving pennies to buy him shoes." Her hands were shaking now, but her voice was steady as a blade. "You all think Elvis Presley is generous? Ask him why his own grandmother has to beg for what everyone else gets freely." Elvis stood up slowly, his face pale as paper. He did not say a word. He simply walked out of his own dining room, leaving his guests to sit in the nuclear fallout of family truth. Dodger sat there, righteous and ruined, having won a battle that destroyed the war. Later that night, Priscilla found Elvis in his bedroom, sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something broken in his eyes that fame and pills had not managed to break. "She is right," he whispered. "I give to everyone except the people who deserve it most." Priscilla tried to comfort him, tried to explain that Dodger's demands were bottomless, that no amount would ever be enough. But Elvis was lost in a memory of watching his grandmother count pennies at a kitchen table that no longer existed. The child who had promised to take care of everyone was now a man discovering that some debts compound interest at rates that bankrupt the soul. The next morning, Elvis wrote Dodger a check for $50,000. She took it without saying thank you. 3 weeks later, she asked for more. The ledger in her dresser drawer showed the number, but it never showed it as enough. Nothing would ever be enough to balance the books of generational poverty. Nothing would ever fill the hole that scarcity had carved into her bones. Graceland became a haunted house after that dinner. Every family gathering carried the threat of another explosion. Every gift Elvis gave was measured against what others received. Every moment of happiness was tinged with the knowledge that love in the Presley family had become transactional, and the price kept going up. Staff members reported finding Dodger in Elvis's office at strange hours, going through papers she had no business reading. When confronted, she would claim she was looking for something she had misplaced, but her eyes would dart to the filing cabinets where financial documents were stored. She was searching for evidence of what everyone else was getting, adding to her mental calculations of what she was owed. The tragedy was that Elvis never stopped loving her. Even as she became the embodiment of every user and taker who would eventually drain him dry, she was still Dodger. Still the woman who had held him through fevers. Still the hands that had taught him to tie his shoes. Still family, with all the weight that word carried in a poor Southern household where family was the only currency that mattered until money became available. But love and resentment can live in the same heart. Dodger proved that every day she spent in Graceland, counting other people's blessings while her own turned bitter in her mouth. The bathroom door at Graceland locked from the inside, which is where Lamar Fike found Elvis at 3 in the morning, sobbing like something inside him had finally shattered beyond repair. Not the careful tears of performance or the frustrated crying of a bad day. These were the sounds of a man discovering that love had been a lie his whole life, or at least love in his family had come with hidden invoices he never knew he was signing. "She sees money when she looks at me," Elvis kept repeating, his voice raw and broken. "Not her grandson, not Elvis, just money." Lamar tried to console him, but what comfort exists for learning that your own blood views you as a bank account with a heartbeat? The pills Elvis swallowed that night were not about numbing physical pain. They were about escaping the revelation that Dodger had given him in one word what everyone in his life actually wanted. Money. Not him. Never really him. The next morning began Elvis's desperate campaign to purchase what had never been for sale, genuine love from his grandmother. A new Cadillac appeared in the Graceland driveway with Dodger's name on the registration. She walked around it once, ran her finger along the hood, and asked if it came with a driver since her arthritis made it hard to steer. The car cost $30,000. Her gratitude lasted 30 seconds. Diamond earrings followed, then a fur coat she would never wear in Memphis heat. Each gift was more elaborate, more expensive, more desperate than the last. Elvis was bidding against himself in an auction where the seller would never be satisfied with the price. Every present came with the unspoken question, is this enough to prove I love you? Is this enough for you to love me back? Red West watched it happen with the sick feeling of witnessing a slow-motion car crash. He had been with Elvis since high school, had seen him navigate fame and heartbreak and the death of his mother. But this was different. This was Elvis discovering that the foundation of his life, family loyalty, Southern values, the bonds of blood, had been rotted through with resentment and greed. He cannot buy his way out of this pain, Red told Sonny one afternoon, but he is going to bankrupt his soul trying. The distance between Elvis and Dodger grew even as the gifts multiplied. She would accept each offering with the same flat expression, the same calculating eyes, the same unspoken message that it was not enough, would never be enough. Graceland became a museum of rejected generosity. Every room held something Elvis had given her that had failed to purchase what he needed, proof that somebody loved him for who he was, not what he could provide. Then came the morning that broke something that would never be repaired. Elvis had been talking about his mother, sharing a memory of Gladys singing to him when he was small. Dodger listened with that expression she had perfected, somewhere between boredom and disdain. When he finished, she set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. Your mother was weak, she said, each word sharp as winter ice. Always crying, always worried, always holding you back. If she had lived, you would never have become what you are. Her dying was the best thing that ever happened to your career. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something breaking, something dying, something that could never be resurrected. Elvis stood up slowly, his face completely blank, which was somehow worse than rage. He walked out of the room with the careful steps of someone carrying something that might explode if handled wrong. Priscilla found him hours later in Gladys's old room, holding a photograph of his mother, whispering apologies to a woman who could not hear them. Apologizing for Dodger's words. Apologizing for the money. Apologizing for becoming someone his mother would not recognize. Apologizing for the fact that success had turned his family into strangers who shared nothing but blood and greed. She did not mean it, Priscilla tried to say, but Elvis cut her off with a look that belonged on a battlefield. She meant every word. She has been waiting years to say it, maybe decades. Financial records from that period show Elvis's spending spiraled completely out of control. He was not buying things anymore. He was throwing money like grenades, hoping something would explode besides his own heart. Cars for strangers, houses for distant relatives, jewelry for people whose names he would not remember the next day. If everyone wanted money, he would give them money until money lost all meaning, until the numbers became abstract, until he could pretend that was all anyone had ever wanted from him anyway. Dodger's demands escalated in direct proportion to Elvis's desperation. She wanted a separate house on the property. She wanted her own staff. She wanted a monthly allowance that exceeded what most Americans made in a year. Each demand came wrapped in the same emotional blackmail, reminders of sacrifice, of suffering, of all the years she had invested in his success. One night, Elvis made the mistake of trying to have an honest conversation with her. He sat across from her in the living room where she held court like a bitter queen and asked her directly, "What would be enough? What number would finally make you feel like I have paid you back?" She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her eyes was colder than anything he had seen there before. "There is not enough money in the world to pay for what I gave you," she said, "but I will take everything you have as a start." Joe Esposito would later describe finding Elvis after that conversation, standing at his bedroom window, looking out at Graceland's gates where fans held their constant vigil. Elvis said something that night that Joe never forgot. "They think those gates keep people out, but they really keep me in. Me and everyone who thinks they own a piece of me." The breaking point came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. Elvis had been in his office trying to focus on tour arrangements when something made him look up. Dodger was in the doorway, but she was not looking at him. She was staring at the open safe behind his desk where he kept cash and important documents. Her expression was not curious. It was hungry. "What are you doing?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. She did not even have the decency to look embarrassed. "Just wondering what my grandson keeps locked away from his family." "Those are legal documents, private documents." "Nothing should be private from the woman who raised you," she responded, moving closer to the safe. That was when Elvis saw what she was really holding, his will. She had somehow gotten it from the safe and had been reading it when he was not looking. Her thumb was on a specific paragraph, and he knew without asking which one, the section about inheritances. "Interesting reading?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. She looked him straight in the eye. "I am just making sure family is taken care of, the real family, the ones who were there before the money." Elvis stood slowly, walked over to her, and gently took the will from her hands. She let it go, but her smile was triumphant. She had seen what she wanted to see. She knew what was coming to her when he died. The fact that she was thinking about his death while he stood alive in front of her was a betrayal that cut deeper than any demand for money ever could. "Get out," he said quietly. "This is my home too," she responded. "Get out of my office, now." She left, but the damage was done. Elvis stood there holding his own will, realizing that his grandmother was not just counting his money. She was counting the days until she could collect it without having to ask. The woman who had helped raise him was waiting for him to die, and she was not even trying to hide it anymore. That night, for the first time in his life, Elvis changed the locks on certain rooms in Graceland. Not to keep strangers out, but to keep family from going through his things, from counting his assets, from planning for his absence while he was still present. The pills he took that night were not about physical pain or even emotional pain. They were about the kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing you have become nothing more than a wallet to the people who should love you most. Marty Lacker found him the next morning, still dressed, still sitting at his desk, still holding that will. When Marty asked if he was all right, Elvis gave him a smile that belonged in a funeral home. "She is waiting for me to die, Marty. My own grandmother is waiting for me to die so she can finally get what she thinks I owe her." August 16, 1977 arrived like any other Tuesday at Graceland, except Elvis Presley would not see Wednesday. Dodger was in her room when the screaming started, when the ambulance arrived, when the king fell from his throne. She did not run to him. She did not cry. She sat in her chair and waited for someone to tell her what she already knew was coming. The waiting was finally over. At the funeral, she wore black, but her eyes were dry as August dirt. Mourners would later remember how she stood at the casket, not looking at Elvis but past him, as if calculating something nobody else could see. Vernon was destroyed, Priscilla was shattered, but Dodger was composed with the stillness of someone whose ship had finally come in. The investment had matured. The ledger could finally be balanced. 3 days after they put Elvis in the ground, she was in the office with lawyers asking about the will. Not grieving, not remembering, not honoring, collecting. Vernon tried to handle things delicately, but Dodger had waited too long to be delicate. She wanted numbers. She wanted dates. She wanted to know exactly when she would receive what 4 decades of sacrifice had earned her. The bitter irony that would haunt Graceland forever was this: she got everything she had demanded and more. Elvis had never written her out, never punished her with disinheritance, never used his final document as revenge for her betrayal. Even knowing she was counting his money while he was alive, even knowing she saw him as an account rather than a grandson, he left her secure. He gave her in death what she had demanded in life, proof that family meant something, even when family had failed him. Linda Thompson would later reveal something Elvis had told her in his final year. "I give money to everyone because I cannot figure out who loves me without it. Maybe nobody does. Maybe that is the price of being Elvis Presley. You never know if anyone would care if you were poor." Dodger outlived Elvis by 3 years, spending them in the comfort his success had purchased. She moved to a smaller house but kept the Cadillac. She wore the jewelry he had given her to church, where she sat in the same pew she had occupied when they were poor, when they were nobody, when love might have been real instead of transactional. Old friends said she never spoke about Elvis as her grandson in those final years. She spoke about him as her employer, her provider. Her meal ticket that had finally paid out. Staff members from Graceland would share stories years later that painted a picture of Elvis's final months that nobody wanted to see. He had become paranoid about money, obsessed with who was taking what, convinced that everyone around him was calculating his worth. He would test people, offering them cash to see how quickly they would take it, then falling into depression when they never refused. Dodger had taught him that love came with a price tag, and he spent his last days trying to figure out what everyone's price was. Jerry Schilling remembered a conversation 2 weeks before Elvis died. They were sitting by the pool at Graceland, watching the sun set over the property that had become a prison. Elvis said something that still haunts Jerry. "You know what the worst part about having money is? You never know if your grandmother would have loved you without it." The question hung there because Jerry did not have an answer that would not have been a lie. Charlie Hodge found notebooks after Elvis died, filled with calculations. Not tour revenues or record sales, but personal equations. How much he had given to each family member, how much they had asked for versus how much they had thanked him. Names with dollar amounts next to them like price tags on relationships. Dodger's name appeared on every page, always at the top, always with the largest numbers, always with a question mark beside it that seemed to ask, was it enough? The saddest discovery came from the Memphis Mafia members who had been there from the beginning. They revealed that Elvis had kept a secret bank account that nobody in his family knew about. Not for himself, not for escape money, but specifically to test whether anyone would visit him, call him, care about him if they thought he was broke. He never used it. He was too afraid of the answer. Nancy Rooks, who worked at Graceland, shared a memory that captured the tragedy perfectly. One morning, she found Elvis sitting in the kitchen at dawn, holding an old photograph from before he was famous. It showed him with Gladys and Dodger at a church picnic, all three of them laughing at something lost to time. He looked up at Nancy with tears in his eyes and asked, "Do you think they were happier when we had nothing?" Nancy did not answer because the truth would have broken what was left of his heart. After Dodger died in 1980, they found her journal, the one she had hidden in her dresser. Every page was filled with numbers, but the final entry was different. Written in shaky handwriting, it was not a number but a sentence. "I asked for money because I did not know how to ask for forgiveness." Below that, in smaller letters, "For teaching him that love was not enough." The family kept that journal private for decades, ashamed of what it revealed about the economy of guilt that had destroyed them all. But the truth has a way of surfacing, like bodies in water, demanding to be acknowledged. Dodger had known what she was doing. She had known she was turning her grandson's love into a transaction. She had known she was teaching him that everyone had a price. She had done it anyway because poverty had taught her that survival mattered more than love. Perhaps the most tragic footnote to this story came from Priscilla, years after everything had ended. She revealed that Elvis had asked her once, late at night when the pills had made him honest, whether she thought Dodger would have loved him if he had stayed poor. Priscilla had said yes to comfort him, but she saw in his eyes that he knew she was lying. Everyone was always lying to Elvis about love because the truth was too expensive to speak. The real inheritance Dodger left was not money but doubt. Every relationship Elvis had was poisoned by the question, "Would you love me without the money?" Every gesture of affection was suspect. Every declaration of love required proof in dollars. She had taught him that love was a transaction, and he spent his life overpaying for something that should have been free. In the end, the woman who had demanded money got exactly what she had asked for. She died comfortable, wealthy by any measure, having outlived the source of that wealth. But she also died knowing she had killed something precious in her grandson, the ability to believe that anyone loved him for who he was rather than what he could provide. Vernon would say at her funeral that Dodger had been a survivor. He was right. She had survived poverty, loss, and hardship, but her survival had come at the cost of her grandson's ability to trust in love. She had turned the king of rock and roll into a man who died surrounded by people, but completely alone, never knowing if a single one of them would have been there if he had been poor. That was Dodger's true legacy, not the money she accumulated, but the doubt she planted, not the comfort she gained, but the love she made conditional, not the survival she achieved, but the soul she helped destroy in the process. She got her money. Elvis paid the price. Every family has its uncomfortable truths about money and love, but what happened between Elvis and Dodger reveals something deeper about how poverty can poison even the strongest bonds. Was she a villain or a victim of circumstances that taught her to survive at any cost? Comment below with your thoughts on whether family and money should ever mix. If these untold stories from inside Graceland move you, subscribe now. Some truths about the king have never been told until now.